if you can't stop Russia invading Ukraine, if you can't protect the civilians of Gaza, then what's the point, people say? Well, my argument is this. Just because you can't fix everything, it doesn't mean you give up on fixing anything. Thank you, Madam President. And let me first congratulate especially the two maiden speakers in our debate tonight, Mr. Murphy and Ms. Khan, as well as the, of course, excellent Sir Geoffrey. I first came across the UN as a teenager visiting my sister Alice in New York. She was a tour guide. And as she took me through the UN corridors and its smoke-filled rooms, I was exhilarated by the promise of saving our people from the scourge of war. Now, my university days at the other place a few miles northeast of here coincided with a period of great global optimism. The Berlin Wall fell, ushering the prospect of peace across Europe and freedom for all. The Rio Earth Summit ushered in the prospect of saving the planet for future generations. A man called Fukuyama wrote of the end of history, and we believed it. Perhaps no coincidence that Lord Hannay was our Perm Rep at the UN at that time. But 30 years later, I will admit the 21st century has been tough for those who believe in the UN as the heart of a rules-based liberal international order. Terrorism on 9/11, just 1 year into the century. War in Afghanistan and Iraq, the crushing of democracy movements in the Arab Spring. Financial crisis, recession, the stalling of globalization. The existential threat of global warming or out of control artificial intelligence. And now, in my time in New York, a permanent member of the Security Council flagrantly violating the UN Charter in an act of naked aggression, and of course, the explosion of the simmering Arab-Israel conflict into its most violent manifestation in more than 50 years. But when the critics, like our colleagues across the hall, blame the UN for the world's ills, who exactly do they mean? 15 Security Council members wielding their veto and gridlocked by divergent interests? Or do they mean the 193 nations of the General Assembly, whose debates can be interminable, nothing like the quality you hear tonight, but where consensus actually reflects the incremental forward march of agreed international rules and standards? Do they mean the chief, so constrained that Kofi Annan called it more secretary than general? Or the agencies from UNICEF to the World Food Programme working to alleviate global suffering, but constrained and directed and pulled in different directions by their hosts, by their governors, by their funders? I'll keep going. Yes, the UN system has its failings. Some are bureaucratic, some are collective, some are individual. And yes, many parts are in need of reform. But more often than not, and as Sir Geoffrey made absolutely clear in his presentation, the shortcomings reflect the divisions between sovereign nations. The complaints about the UN are proxies for dissatisfaction with the world as it is. So let me make the case for the UN with some examples of a system that has changed our world and our lives for the better. First, global health. The UN is central to fighting disease and has been for decades. Take polio. A 1988 World Health Assembly resolution launched a process that led to the almost eradication of polio to the extent that cases fell by 99% from 350,000 in more than 125 countries in 88 to just 6 cases worldwide in 2021. Second, climate, as has been referred to. The UN was ahead of most governments in calling for action on climate change. The scientific evidence base comes from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The negotiations are done by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Yes, governments have to do more. Yes, producers, consumers have to do less. But that's not the UN, that's member states. If we didn't have the UN architecture, we would have to invent it. Third, let's talk about technology. The General Assembly's first resolution was on the peaceful use of atomic energy, a technology whose terrible destructive power had just been demonstrated only months before. This resolution was passed in 1946 in London. That mission is as important today as it was in the time of Oppenheimer. And just last week, I spoke to the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, about the work his teams are doing to keep nuclear reactors safe in Ukraine, despite the conflict, despite Russian occupation, and the work they are doing to contain and constrain the ambitions of North Korea and Iran to get nuclear weapons. I'm afraid I'll keep going. Fourth, human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as Sir Geoffrey said, was a landmark agreement, and the architecture of human rights from Geneva to The Hague, and the expansion of human rights through conferences and negotiations to women, children, minority groups, has been extraordinary. But yes, the system is under strain. The system is creaking. But again, where it falls short for the Uyghur in China, for women in Afghanistan, for the children of Bosnia, that system is being pressured by countries who evade and constrain and avoid their commitments. But what's the alternative? We go back to a Hobbesian world, a world of no law, a world of no UN. And finally, let's talk about peace and security, because the most maligned part of the UN system is the Security Council. If you can't stop Russia invading Ukraine, if you can't protect the civilians of Gaza, then what's the point, people say? Well, my argument is this: just because you can't fix everything, it doesn't mean you give up on fixing anything. And in my time in the last 3 years, I've seen the UN doing extraordinary things despite the geopolitical tensions, despite the constraints of veto power. So just last year, we passed 90 resolutions, statements. What does that mean? That means the UN taking steps to support concretely peace processes in Yemen and in Colombia. It means security operations, multinational operations going to Haiti and Somalia, backed by UN law. It means vital humanitarian operations from Syria to the Black Sea to Gaza have an international basis. So, friends, there was never a golden age of multilateralism in which everything was perfect. The UN itself was always an imperfect construct, a deal, a compromise struck between the victors of the 1945 war and the rest of the world. Great power rivalry, frozen by Cold War, mutually assured destruction, and the veto. A long march of decolonization, development, and the expansion of rights and freedoms, but also a period interspersed by pockets of authoritarianism, violent nationalism, or stubborn inequality and poverty. The people of Angola to Afghanistan, from Cambodia to Colombia, from Yemen to the former Yugoslavia, have all lived through that period. But as Dag Hammarskjöld said, the UN was created not to lead mankind to heaven, but to save us from hell. There can surely be no doubt that the last 80 years with the UN have been better for humanity, for mankind, than the 80 years before the UN. Billions lifted out of poverty, life expectancy surging across the globe, hundreds of millions in dozens of countries enjoying freedom from imperial rule, authoritarian control, beyond the dreams of their parents and their grandparents. No bomb to match Nagasaki and Hiroshima. No direct war between great powers. So for all its limits, the UN system is a remarkable construct. It represents and it reflects the world we live in, and that's a world in which the majority are striving daily for a more secure, more prosperous, and more peaceful world. And for that, my friends, the UN needs our support, and it needs the confidence of this House tonight. Thank you.